Hello, everyone, and welcome back to us for the 11th podcast. Today, we begin picking up in 1 Samuel where we left off last time. If you remember, last time Samuel was very upset with David. In fact, even the Lord was upset with him, and he said that he had regretted making Saul king over Israel for the decisions that Saul was making. So today we get into beginning where Samuel anoints David, and then David begins. Many of this story is when he fights Goliath and other things in these situations. So this is when we start here. And one of the things that I like about this particularly is where we started here, where Samuel's anointing David, and he's going around and probably very much like we would do. He assumes that someone who's big and strong, that looks the part, is going to be the person who God would want to be the king. And as he goes through all of Jesse's boys or men, whatever you want to call them at the time, everyone says no, and he makes that point, is like, is this all of your boys? Is this all of them? And he goes, well, there's the youngest is out in the field, and he makes the comment of, well, send him. We won't sit down until he gets here, and then when he gets here, the Lord tells him to anoint him. But one of the words that he says is humans only, and in my version it says humans only see what is visible to the eyes, but the Lord sees into the heart. And so a lot of times when we're going through life, when we're doing things, it's easy to look what you think is the right thing, but it's not always the right thing for what we're doing.
And throughout the story, I mean, the story of David ends with the description of David being a man after God's own heart. Yeah. And I think that David had many places that he may not have been everything that we could have hoped for in a hero, but his heart was always in the right place. Yeah. And I think that's crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the truth too. And once they get into this point, and it's not long after he's anointed that he gets introduced to Saul. I mean, Saul's having
nightmares.
These nightmares, and he says, "Please get somebody who can play music." And David ends up getting in there to play and to keep him calm. In this sense, and so you see in this song one that not long afterwards that he's getting introduced to Saul very quickly into the sense to know where he is. And Saul actually likes David in the beginning, in the beginning, because he's the one that can soothe them. He's the one that can do this. And it says Saul liked David very much, and David became his armor bearer. And he sent a message to Jesse saying, "Please allow David to remain in my service because I'm pleased with him."
I think one of the interesting things here in this portion of 1 Samuel, for me, it reminds me of the oral nature that stands behind the scriptures. Because when we put, it's hard to put the story of David being anointed, coming to sing for Saul, and then somehow or other, when David comes back in front to confront Goliath, Saul doesn't remember him. So, I mean, the most likely thing is that these were two different stories that were present, and which one happened first, which one happened second, was not really a concern.
Right.
Much more important was to say, here's the story that shows us that David cared for people and sang well. Here's the story that tells us that David was brave and trusted in God.
Yeah.
And they both are there. It's very hard to hold on to the details and make them precisely line up with our sense of history.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we get into this part, we got into here, we saw how David is acting, and now the Philistines are beginning to to battle, and they're interlinked to battle, and this is the part where David comes into the more apt. But you see the battle coming on, and the Israelites really not doing much of what they're doing. And it almost seems like they're afraid. It seems like they're just not. No one is stepping up to say, "I'll be the one who's going to fight Goliath." After he's calling them out, like send them out, send someone out here, and no one budges in the sense. Yeah.
Well, that was the history of the Philistines. I'm not sure whether or not we have talked about this already in the podcast. If we have, I apologize for repeating. But the Philistines, it's interesting. There's very little historical record of who these Philistines were before this time. Yeah. They seem to have just appeared there at the coast of Israel, in those coastal communities, and they seem to have had greater technology somehow or other, whether it was a better steel for their swords or what, but somehow or other, they just suddenly are extremely powerful. Yeah. And everybody, not just the Israelites, but all of the peoples of the Middle East were frightened.
Yeah, much so. And so you see this thunder, and you see Goliath coming out, and you see this time, and the calling out, the people coming out to say who will go out, and David goes to Saul and says, I will go out, and Saul, sort of just going. It's like you can't go out, like you can't go out and do this. You're still a boy, and they needed to. He's again looking for the warrior, not the boy. And so they're in this sense, and you kind of see the differences. Goliath was very tall. He was muscular, had all this armor and protection, from helmets to shields to covering his shins to even a protector on his back, and he had a shield bearer in front of him. And then there's just David, who doesn't have anything except his sling in the stone, because the armor was too heavy. He tried to put it on and he couldn't wear it. And
Saul tried to.
You see that difference as like from the boy to the warrior of how much difference he couldn't do. Yes.
Yeah, Saul tried to put the armor onto David, and David said, I can't wear it. This isn't me. This isn't the way I fight. And I think that, a lot has been made over the years about the need for us to be true to who God has called us to be, and using this as a metaphor of the times that we try to wear somebody else's armor and not come as ourselves. Yeah. There are a lot of little details in this story that preachers have pointed to over the years. That being one, I come in the name of the Lord. The battle belongs to the Lord, David says, and that reminder that is there. One of the interesting pieces is the stones that he takes. That he takes 5 smooth stones. There are some who say that that's because Goliath had 4 brothers, and 5 stones would take care of the whole family. I've never read that detail in the scriptures, but there certainly were 5 cities of the Philistines. So the 5 stones gets connected to that.
And so we know the battle, we know what happens. David just, goes up to him. He takes his sling, he stews him, hits him right in the forehead, and Goliath dies, basically falls there. David does what he says he's going to do, cuts his head and takes it, and everything goes from there. But it was David prevailed in this thing, and he began to become popular among the people for this sense, because not only was he winning that, he began to win other battles, and people began coming back, and even as you'll see into words saying Saul killed thousands, David killed 10,000s, and that just made it worse for Saul because he was getting jealous of David's power in this sense. And so as this is going on, even Saul's son Jonathan comes into the thing as we get into chapter 18, and Jonathan and David come, and Jonathan sees the success that David has. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is here in remembering this was like Jonathan basically relinquished his title to the throne and gave his robe to David, because he would have been the next in line to go, but he took it off, gave it to David, because he knew that David would. It's almost like Jonathan knew that David was going to be that person who would take over after that sense.
Yeah, we talked a little outside of the podcast about the relationship between David and Jonathan. It is clearly very, very close, very, very affectionate. There are scholars that read the story and come away from the relationship just as you were saying, that Jonathan knew that David is the one to take over, and he was humble and he was caring, and they just had a dear friendship that spanned their life. There are, and we need to name it, there are scholars that look at the relationship between David and Jonathan and read in it more than ordinary friendship, that it was a romance, that they did have what we would call ordinary affection for one another. It says Jonathan loved David as himself. It says that they made a covenant with one another. It said that it speaks of them kissing. There are these signs. I do think our reading of the scriptures and being insistent that either it couldn't have been a romance or it had to be a romance says more about us than it does the scriptures.
Yeah.
I think both are possible. And to live in that ambiguity is the call.
Yeah. And either way we look at it, the truth was there was a very strong relationship between the two. I mean, it's easy to see. It's easy no matter what you think in either way. They had a strong love for each other in whatever way you want to look at it in that essence. And so as begin to get on, like Saul, like as we talk about, Saul begins to become jealous of David because of the success he's having, even to the point where there's never a time when Saul's never discredited. It's just he sees people reacting to David, and he becomes jealous as he figures he's the king and he should be the one that's getting the women to sing and dance for him, and these kind of situations, and what they're doing was really highlighting David's success, not discrediting Saul for what he did, but just saying this is what we did. But Saul took it as a different way, and so throughout the time now he's seen his success, Saul begins to try to find ways to basically kill David.
He throws a spear at him 3 separate times.
Yes.
And sends an army to hunt him down. Saul wants to get rid of David.
That quickly. He was the one that sued them. Now he wants to get rid of him.
He chases him all over the desert to the point that that David eventually goes to the Philistines.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
He turns to Israel's enemy because he does not feel that he has a place in Israel's court.
Yep.
One of my very favorite stories is the story of David in the cave. And Saul goes into the cave for what in my family is known as a private moment.
Yes.
And while there, David sneaks up and cuts off a cut of the corner of Saul's robe. After Saul leaves the cave, David appears and says, if I'd wanted to kill you, I could have. Yep. Such a wonderful story to keep in our scriptures.
Yes.
And I think a reminder of David's integrity in many ways, that he was, David presumably believed himself anointed king. Mm-hmm. Presumably he believed the word that Samuel spoke over him. Mm-hmm. He certainly heard the crowd singing his praises, certainly felt all of that, and yet time and again said, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. Mm-hmm. I will not. No, that's not going to work out. Right. Again, this idea of David being a man after God's own heart.
Yes, absolutely. And he did what was the right thing to do, because as much times as even his followers or soldiers were telling him, hey, you have your chance, you can get rid of your enemy. And he's that very thing you said. He's like, no, he was God's anointed, and that is not my place to do that. And you see throughout, like, David ends up saving Saul. I don't say save, but he spared his life more than one time, and in each time just coming into that situation, and the battles just continue. You continue to move on, you continue to go, and eventually it gets to a point where Saul and Jonathan end up in a battle, and they both end up dying, and David is eventually anointed king to move into, and that leads us kind of into that next thing. Go ahead.
I think that it's worth noting this wonderful moment at the end of 1 Samuel in chapter 31, after Saul and Jonathan have been killed. It is David who comes and cares for the bodies, and cuts them down, and cares for them, and prepares them for that,
into that next situation. Yeah, this was the one part that, as we get ready to move in this aspect, was one of the things that shocked me here, and I just never remembered ever reading it, was that at the end, as you said, as David is the one who's putting them off the shelf to take care of them, that they burned the bodies. And I've never read that. I probably read it, but it just stuck to me that it's like that they went back where they burned them, and then they took them and buried them under a tree at Breath. But it just shocked me to read that part of burning, because I just, when you think of cremation or you think of things that way, it just was something that was different for me. It's like I don't ever remember reading something about a body being burned in the scriptures, and lo and behold, it was there.
There you go.
But this leads us into 2 Samuel as we go. So after the death of Jonathan and David, or Jonathan and Saul, David learns of their death. He mourns for them, and then he is made king, but not over everything at first. He's only made king of Hebron first, which is, I believe, in Judah. in that aspect, and so he's only made the thing, and then conflict begins to arise as he goes between Judah and Israel themselves, and go through.
And it's almost as if the tribes then elect David to be king.
It's true.
In chapter 5, it says, all the tribes came together and said, and made a pact with them. King David made a pact with them in Hebron, and they anointed David king.
To go through. Yeah.
That there is, there is that sense of, I find myself thinking about that phrase in the Declaration, in our Declaration of Independence, of legitimate government derives its power from the consent of those governed. And it is as if the tribes give their consent.
Yeah, for sure. When this goes into the more struggles of, you see there, Saul's son, I don't know how you say, Ishbosheth or whoever, he becomes king of Israel, and then you become the battles become, David is ruler of Judah for 7.5 years. The struggle between David and Saul's family basically is going back and forth, and then but eventually David becomes king of both in these of Israel and Judah in the saints, and he begins to bring the Ark and the Covenant back to Jerusalem, and that's about where. In the very end of one last thing you do is in chapter 7, God made a promise to David as it goes into this thing that his dynasty, that his word was going to continue throughout, that there'd always be somebody, and that his son would be the one who was to build the temple and not David in that sense.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to see in there the play on words that is a part of this conversation of chapter 7. David wants to build a temple. Mm-hmm. He says he will build a house for God. Nathan says, do what you have proposed to do. It sounds good. But then God appears and says to David, you will not build me a house, I will build you a house. And in that is the play on words. You will not build a place for me to dwell, I will build a dynasty for you. It's that dual meaning of house, of a place to live and a family, a lineage. And I think that it's a wonderful poetic kind of phrasing.
Absolutely. Yep. And that kind of leads us into, for this, as the end of this part, as we see this part, and even in the end of part, one of the beautiful ends of chapter 7 is David's prayer, when he just basically is like, who am I? But you're God, and that was just beautiful for me or he is just really proclaiming Lord of his life. Like, if it wasn't for God, none of this would be possible type situation. So, but we will close here, and then we will pick up with you all next week as we finish here and begin in 2 Samuel and get into 1 Kings.